biographies are coming out of both FDR and MacArthur, and of course, that's a featured incident in any biography of either of those two, because it was a dramatic meeting that took place, first time they had met in 7 years, in two of, as I said, two of the most colorful figures of that period of American history. For that reason, and I think this actually started during the war in the way that the press covered this event, we have tended to look at that meeting through the prism of American politics. Immediately before leaving on his trip that took him to Hawaii, FDR had announced, to nobody's surprise, that he was going to run for an unprecedented fourth term of office as president, and then had visited the Democratic National Convention on his way out to the West Coast. So the way the press observed, essentially the way the country saw this trip to Hawaii, was that it was a campaign stop. It was a publicity event. In fact, it was much more than that. It was a very substantive command conference, and FDR was doing something which I think we would have expected any commander-in-chief to do, which is to visit the Pacific Theater. It's the only time he did it. And for the millions of men and women who were fighting under our flag in the Pacific, that visit told them that they had not been forgotten, and I think that was important. So, why begin it with that long account of the press and of that visit? I think that it was important to try to unite what had become these two, very separate kind of strands in literature of this biographical or political kind of a view of this meeting between MacArthur and FDR, and what was a very substantive and historically important military planning conference that involved FDR, MacArthur, also Nimitz, and also Admiral Leahy, who's almost always forgotten, but this was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a very low-profile figure who was immensely important in this period of American history.
Wrote some of the greatest memoirs of the Pacific War and the Roosevelt presidency as well. Leahy.
I agree. Yeah.
So we'll get to the strategic talk at that Oahu conference, but before we sort of move away from the politics, tell us about MacArthur in 1944. There was a move to make him president, was there? How badly did he want to get into the Oval Office in 1944?
Well, yeah, MacArthur, flirted with the presidency many times throughout his career. Actually, beginning in the 1920s, he had been, his name had been sort of floated in Republican circles. And as you say, in 1944, he allowed his supporters in the states, these were powerful members of Congress in the Republican Party, certain conservative media owners, and various other figures on the American right, who saw MacArthur as potentially their only chance to defeat FDR in a wartime election. And so they essentially sort of started this dark horse campaign with MacArthur's implicit connivance. And it didn't lead anywhere, and the reasons for that is essentially because the governor of New York, Tom Dewey, locked up the nomination early in the primary process. But yes, the question has been asked, and historians and biographers have debated, did MacArthur actually want to run for president, and would he have liked to become president? Or was this just a way of exerting pressure on the president and on the Joint Chiefs to do what he wanted to do in the Pacific, which essentially involved sending more military assets to MacArthur's command? The Pacific was divided, as you know. The northern half was essentially under the control of the Navy. Chester Nimitz was the theater commander. And then in the Southwest Pacific, you had MacArthur. This division of the Pacific into two semi-autonomous theater commands was very controversial and was regarded as essentially a way of settling this rivalry between the Army and the Navy, satisfying MacArthur, leaving the Navy in charge of the naval war. And so, this question of, would MacArthur eventually gain supreme command in the Pacific, which was his goal? And then secondly, could he ensure that our route back to Tokyo went through the Philippines and that he would get the green light to liberate the Philippines, including critically the northern island of Luzon? And so these were his goals. And this kind of dark horse campaign for president may simply have been a way of exerting pressure in order to fulfill those goals.
How about FDR? You write marvelously early on in the book that the war had changed him. This was a kind of happy warrior type. His press conferences used to be ones for the ages earlier in his presidency. He'd be joshing with the reporters. He knew whose birthday it was, whose children were having that day, making jokes back and forth. It's not really FDR by this point of the war, is it?
No, FDR, of course, this was the longest presidency in American history, and often, I remember at the outset of our current president's administration, there was a story, I believe it was in the Washington Post, but it was about FDR's relationship with the press. And it was about how clever he was at essentially using the sort of charm tactics that he was famous for to get the press on his side. And that's an accurate depiction of how FDR dealt with the press in his first term in office. By his third term, 1941, he had essentially had it with the press. He really was deeply offended, I think, in general, at the way the press was covering politics. A number of his bitterest enemies were major media owners. And